Hi, my name is Roxanne, and over the last 50 years, I have reinvented myself, rebranded myself, renamed myself several times. And finally, I've come full circle. I'm Roxanne. It's the name my mother gave me. Actually, that's another story. It was actually my grandmother that named me. And I just want to share my thoughts on life, especially as it relates to women and the things that we as women have been through for centuries. I come from at least three generations of strong Black women. Two of them I knew very well. One I knew about because of the stories I was told about her. She died the same year I was born. They called her Mama. So there's Mama, there's Granny, and then there's my mother. And over the last few weeks, I've been thinking about them a lot and about all of the things that they accomplished in spite of the fact that they weren't highly educated, they weren't what people would imagine success would look like, but they were extremely successful. And the more I think about it, the more fascinated I am by what they were able to accomplish. Mama was born in the last century of the 1800s. So around 1890, Mama was born. Um, Maybe 1880, 80s. Um, Granny was born in the early 20th century, 1913 to be exact. My mother, Ma, was born in 1933, and I was born in 1953. That was the year Mama passed. And as I look back at the lives of these women, I realize how strong they were and how I never recognized, acknowledged, or appreciated their strength until now. Mama was born into what was probably the first full generation of African Americans that were not born into slavery. She was one of the older children of a large family, and she married a man that was debonair, handsome, very tall, and quite the ladies' man, Papa. They had at least five children, maybe six, but four of those children grew to be adults. The oldest of them was my grandmother, Granny. Now, for whatever reason, or maybe it was just coincidence, from my grandmother, my mama, my great grandmother, all the way through to my mother, every person in my family, their name began with E. Papa's name was Edward. Mama's name was Elsie. They had two daughters, Edna, my grandmother, and her sister, Elva. Elva had a daughter named Elsie. My grandmother, Edna, had three children and a husband whose names all began with E. Her husband, Ernest, her son, Ernest Jr., my mother, Irma, and my aunt, Evelyn. Okay, so let's forward 20 years, and my mother's pregnant with me. And she is deciding what to name me. And if she followed tradition, my name, she said, would have been Erica. But her mother said, it's enough. I have another name I want to give her. And she named me Roxanne. As I look back at these women, I realize that they accomplished things that most people didn't think Black women could accomplish at the time. Mama was married and stayed married until she died. This was the first generation of African Americans who had actually been able to get married and have families. My grandmother got married and remained married until her husband died. Were they perfect marriages? No, they weren't. And one of the reasons they weren't perfect was because of the culture that developed of how Black men and Black women related to one another. Um, Papa was a very, um, he was a ladies' man, okay? And it caused my grandmother it caused my great grandmother a lot of pain. There was always another woman, there was always a relationship. Um, and basically, the children that they had were all born, each child was born in a different state because Papa was always up to something that caused them to get run out of town. And that something was usually a woman, a daughter, a sister, somebody that Papa was messing around with, and it would come to a head and they had to leave town. But Mama was always with him. Where he went, she went. So each one of her children was born in a different state. Now, my grandmother went to high school, which was an extreme accomplishment in the 1920s and 30s for African Americans. She finished high school and she married a man, my grandfather, called him Grandpa. She was my granny. And um, she went through a lot because we, as a people, then and some of us now, had issues with color, with shade. And Granny was darker than Grandpa, and his family gave her a hard time for that. Grandpa drank. he was, I guess, what you would call a functional alcoholic. He went to work every day. He brought his paycheck home. He supported his wife and his children. But there were times when his drinking, and probably my grandmother's fussing, would cause him to be physically violent. But Grandpa's problem was Granny could be just as physically violent as he was. So there was never a beating, there was a fight. So Grandpa eventually learned not the best plan. You know, don't try it, it won't work. Unfortunately, my mother married a man who also was a functional alcoholic, but he had other vices as well. He drank, he gambled, and too often she had to meet him at his job to get his check before he spent it at the racetrack. If she didn't get there soon enough, if he got paid on Friday, we wouldn't see him until the money was gone. Now, I didn't know this, I was a child. But as time went on, it became too difficult for her to deal with. And my mother decided that her best course of action was to get a divorce. That was a scandal. My grandmother felt like, what makes you different from the rest of us? We've had to put up with this. Why can't you put up with it? Women have been going through this with men for hundreds of years. Why all of a sudden you can't do it? Well, she was right. Why should she have to put up with that? Why should that be the norm? So they separated and eventually divorced. And I thought that my mother struggled so hard, and she did, to raise my brother and I and make sure that we had everything that we need. I know there were times that she cried and we didn't know about it. But when I look back now, I realize that my mother was strong. Wow. She was such a strong woman. By the time I was 15, my mother had bought a new car. A Volkswagen. At the time it cost less than $2,000. And a home. We lived in that house for 1 year, and she decided she wanted a bigger house. So she sold the one and bought a larger house. She lived in that house till I was about 25. She sold that house. She bought a better house. She lived there for a few years. She sold it, and she bought a condominium. I look back now, and my mother was able to do better with every house that she bought. And she spent and bought and paid for all on her own all those years. I never realized it. I never realized how great she was, how financially savvy she was in order to do this. My granny, her mother, managed to save enough money with my grandfather, in spite of my grandfather, whatever. She decided she wanted a more stable environment. And when I was a little girl, I was probably 2 years old, my grandmother bought a three-flat apartment building, and she moved my mother and her family into one apartment, my aunt and her family into one apartment, and she lived in the third apartment with my grandfather. When I was 14, she decided it was time to do something different. And she rented out the building and moved into a house far, far from that building. A few years later, she sold it and lived, continued to live in the house that she had bought. After my grandfather passed, she sold that house, moved in with my mother briefly, and then the two of them bought separate condominiums, but together. One was on upstairs and the other was downstairs, so they lived next door to one another. I'm telling you this because my goal at this point is to talk about women and how we've been undervalued, how we've been misrepresented, how we've been abused, and go on a journey of discovery and hopefully begin to change some of the things that people think about when they think about women today. So, soon I'll make more videos and we'll get to know one another. For now, bye.